My sister walked into the Fulton County courtroom, smiling like she had already won the lottery. "Best day ever," she whispered loudly as she took her seat at the heavy wooden table. She and her arrogant husband thought the judge was just going to sign the papers, evict me from our family estate, and hand them everything they had ever wanted. But halfway through her tearful performance about how I supposedly stole her inheritance, the judge suddenly raised a hand. "Before we continue," he said calmly, opening a thick red file that my lawyer had just handed to the bailiff, "there is something the court needs to address immediately." My sister's fake smile completely vanished. Her husband turned pale, his smug posture crumbling in an instant. The room went dead silent. And that was the exact moment they realized they had messed with the wrong woman. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who completely underestimated your worth. And share this video if you know how satisfying it is to watch karma finally do its job. My name is Chloe Jenkins. I am 34 years old, and I am the owner of a highly successful private equity firm in Atlanta that specializes in acquiring distressed debt. To put it simply, I buy up people's bad financial decisions and turn them into my profit. Right now, I am pacing across the rich hardwood floors of my downtown penthouse, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the glowing Atlanta skyline. The city lights stretch out for miles, a glittering reminder of everything I have built with my own two hands. I pour myself another glass of aged bourbon, the amber liquid catching the soft light of the room. My home is my sanctuary, decorated in warm tones, rich walnut wood, and heavy leather furniture. Every single piece of art, every rug, every detail was paid for by my own sweat and late nights. I did not inherit my success, and I certainly did not marry into it like my sister did. I earned it by being smarter, tougher, and more resilient than anyone in my family ever gave me credit for. I cannot help but smile when I think about the absolute destruction of my sister and her husband. I am entirely in control of my life, my wealth, and my peace of mind now. But to truly understand how we reached that explosive moment of legal and financial ruin, we have to go back to that chilly courtroom and examine the sheer audacity of the people I used to call family. It was a Tuesday morning, and the air conditioning in the courtroom was freezing, sending a chill through the massive room. But my biological sister, Serena, looked like she was ready for a high-fashion magazine shoot, rather than a legal hearing. She wore a tailored white Chanel suit that I knew for an absolute fact she had put on a credit card she could barely afford to pay off. Serena is 38 years old, the absolute golden child of our family, and someone who firmly believes the universe owes her a life of endless luxury just for existing. Growing up, Serena was given everything she ever pointed at. If she wanted piano lessons, my parents bought her a grand piano. If she wanted a car for her 16th birthday, a brand new convertible was waiting in the driveway. I, on the other hand, was expected to quietly step aside, be grateful for whatever scraps of attention were left, and never outshine her. When I got a full scholarship to college, my mother told me not to brag because it might make Serena feel bad about dropping out. That toxic dynamic never changed, even as we became adults. Serena married Brad, a man who shared her belief that the world owed them a red carpet. Sitting right next to her was Brad, my white brother-in-law. Brad is a financial broker who loves to throw around aggressive corporate buzzwords and act like he is the smartest, most important guy in any room he walks into. He possesses that classic, unearned confidence, carrying a deep sense of entitlement that always made my skin crawl. He always looked down on me because I never fit into his narrow, privileged view of what success should look like for a Black woman. To him, I was just the quiet younger sister who was supposed to be pushed around, intimidated, and eventually erased from the family picture. They had dragged me to court that morning with one vicious, calculated goal: to legally evict me from the $4 million Victorian estate our late father had left behind. and to squeeze me for $300,000 in what they boldly called back rent. They had submitted an updated version of a will they found stuffed in a drawer, convinced it gave them absolute authority over my life and my home. Brad had brought a whole team of slick, expensive lawyers with him. They were all wearing tailored suits, whispering to each other, and looking at me like I was nothing more than a minor inconvenience standing in the way of their big payday. They shuffled their papers and polished their expensive pens, completely underestimating the quiet woman sitting across the aisle. My lawyer, on the other hand, sat completely still. We did not need to whisper. We did not need to shuffle papers. We already knew exactly how this was going to end. We were holding a royal flush, and we were just waiting for Brad to push all his chips to the center of the table. As we waited for the judge to finish reviewing their initial documents, Brad leaned across the heavy wooden table dividing us. He did not even bother to lower his voice, wanting to make sure I heard every single word of his disrespect. "Enjoy your last few days playing rich, Chloe," he sneered, straightening his expensive silk tie with a smug grin. "You are completely out of your league here. Once the judge signs off on this paperwork, you will be lucky if we even let you pack your bags before we change the locks. Maybe you can go rent a cheap, tiny apartment downtown where you actually belong." Serena chimed in right on cue, perfectly playing the role of the exhausted victim. She placed her manicured hand on her chest and sighed loudly. "It is just so unfair that you have been hoarding Daddy's massive house all to yourself, Chloe. Brad and I have a real family. We actually need the space and the equity to invest in our future and our children. It is time you stop being so incredibly selfish and give up what is obviously not yours." I did not yell. I did not raise my voice or defend myself. I just sat there in my custom-tailored charcoal suit, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact with Brad. I let him bask in his own delusion. He really thought a flimsy piece of paper he found in my father's old desk was going to magically transfer millions of dollars of prime real estate into his greedy, undeserving hands. He genuinely thought his expensive team of slick lawyers and his aggressive, condescending attitude were enough to intimidate me. He had no idea he was trying to bully a woman who literally negotiates multi-million-dollar foreclosures for a living. I took a slow sip of water and let the silence stretch between us, watching his smug grin falter just a fraction under my deadpan stare. The judge finally cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he looked over the towering stack of documents Brad's high-priced legal team had submitted to the court. "Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Sterling," the judge began, his deep voice echoing loudly in the quiet, tense room. "You are asking this court to validate this specific document and immediately forcibly remove Miss Jenkins from the property. You are also requesting a judgment of $300,000 for unpaid rent over the last 5 years. "That is exactly correct, Your Honor," Brad answered smoothly, standing up with an arrogant posture, practically puffing his chest out. "Miss Jenkins has been illegally occupying the estate since her father passed. We are simply trying to rectify the situation, clear the title, and claim what rightfully belongs to my wife and our family." The judge slowly closed their folder and picked up a completely different one. It was a thick, heavy red file that my lawyer had quietly handed to the bailiff 10 minutes earlier, before the proceedings even officially started. The judge opened the red file, his eyes scanning the first few pages. Then he let out a heavy sigh, looking directly at Brad with an expression that bordered on absolute pity. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, the tone of the room suddenly shifting to something dangerously cold and incredibly serious. "Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with this claim today? Because I am warning you right now, if we continue this hearing, the person leaving this courtroom with a warrant for their arrest is going to be you." Brad's smug smile completely cracked. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like he had just seen a ghost. Serena stopped pretending to cry and stared at the judge in utter confusion, her mouth hanging slightly open as the words registered in her brain. I took a slow, deep breath, relishing the look of pure, unadulterated panic washing over my brother-in-law's face. But to understand exactly how Brad walked so blindly into a trap of his own making, and how my own flesh and blood tried to leave me completely homeless, we need to rewind. We need to go back 3 months to the rainy afternoon we buried our father, which was the exact day this ruthless war officially began. The rain was pouring down in heavy sheets as I walked away from my father's freshly covered grave. The scent of wet earth and crushed lilies was thick in the cold air. My heart was heavy, but I did not have the luxury of grieving in peace. As I approached my car parked near the edge of the cemetery, I saw them waiting for me. Brad was leaning casually against the driver's side door of my vehicle, completely unaffected by the solemnity of the day. Serena stood right beside him, perfectly dry under a massive black umbrella, looking more like she was attending a dark-themed fashion show than her own father's funeral. I clicked my keys to unlock the car, expecting them to step aside. They did not move an inch. Instead, Brad reached into the inside pocket of his expensive, custom-tailored suit and pulled out a crisp manila envelope. He did not offer condolences. He did not ask how I was holding up. He just slapped the envelope down on the wet hood of my car. "That is a formal 30-day notice to vacate, Chloe," Brad said, crossing his arms with an unbearable look of superiority. "I have already started the probate paperwork with my legal team. Serena and I are taking over the Victorian estate. As the rightful heads of the family now, we have to make the hard decisions." I stood there in the pouring rain, staring at the envelope, and then slowly looked up at his smug face. I could not believe the sheer audacity. We had just put my father in the ground, not even 20 minutes ago. But Brad could not wait. His white entitlement was practically suffocating. He genuinely believed that because he was a white man working in finance, he automatically held dominion over me and my family assets. He spoke to me slowly, over-enunciating his words as if he were explaining basic math to a slow child. "Look, I know you do not understand how real estate law and probate courts work," Brad continued, gesturing vaguely with his hand. "But the estate is a massive financial asset, and it is completely wasted on a single woman living alone. My brokerage firm is expanding rapidly, and I need the capital from the sale of that house to secure a major commercial investment. It is just basic economics, Chloe. You should start looking for a small condo. I know a guy who can get you a good deal on a cheap lease." I did not touch the envelope. I looked over at my sister. Serena was examining her perfectly manicured nails, refusing to meet my eyes. She had always let Brad do her dirty work while she played the innocent princess. I was just about to tell Brad exactly what he could do with his ridiculous eviction notice when I heard footsteps splashing on the wet pavement behind me. It was my mother, Vivian. For a brief, incredibly naive second, the little girl inside of me thought my mother was coming to comfort me. My father was gone. I was standing freezing in the rain, being cornered and harassed by my brother-in-law. I turned toward her, my shoulders dropping as I prepared for a warm embrace. But Vivian walked right past me. She did not even brush my shoulder. She walked straight over to Brad and Serena, wrapping her arms around her golden child and her perfect son-in-law, shielding them from the cold. "Are you causing trouble already, Chloe?" my mother asked, her voice sharp and dripping with utter disappointment. Her eyes glared at me from under Serena's large umbrella. "Brad is trying to handle the complex family business so we do not have to stress about it during this tragic time. The absolute least you could do is cooperate and show some respect." "Cooperate," I repeated, my voice steady despite the intense rage building in my chest. "He is trying to throw me out of the house I live in, Mom, the house Dad left. He wants to sell it to fund his own business ventures." "And he absolutely should," Vivian snapped back immediately, stepping forward. "Brad is a financial expert. He knows how to grow money and secure generational wealth. What are you going to do with a massive Victorian house? You are single. You have no children. You are just being incredibly selfish as always. Your sister has a real family to think about. They need that capital to secure their future. You need to stop acting like a spoiled brat and hand over those keys today. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. The blatant favoritism was nothing new, but the absolute cruelty of doing this at my father's funeral, mere feet away from his grave, was a sickening new low. They were treating me like an annoying squatter in my own life. I took a deep breath, keeping my expression entirely blank. Brad is not a financial expert, I said calmly, my voice cutting through the sound of the heavy rain. He is a glorified salesman drowning in corporate debt, and neither of you have any legal right to that house. The words had barely left my lips before Vivian lunged forward. Her hand cracked across my face with a sickening loud smack. The slap echoed sharply in the quiet cemetery parking lot. My head snapped to the side from the force of the blow. The sting was immediate and intense. A hot red mark blooming across my cheek in the freezing rain. "Do not you ever disrespect the man of this house," Vivian hissed, her chest heaving with blinding anger. "Brad is doing what is best for the Sterling and Jenkins family legacy. You will sign whatever paperwork he gives you, or you will no longer be a part of this family. Do you understand me?" Serena gasped softly, playing the shocked and delicate bystander, while Brad just smirked. He looked incredibly satisfied that my own mother had physically put me in my place to defend his fragile ego. They stood there together, a united, impenetrable front of pure toxicity, waiting for me to break. They waited for the tears to fall. They waited for me to apologize, to crumble the way I used to when I was an insecure teenager, desperately seeking their approval. But the woman standing in front of them was not a scared little girl anymore. I did not shed a single tear. I did not even raise my hand to touch my stinging cheek. I slowly turned my head back to look at them. The cold rain washed over my face, but inside, my blood was turning to pure, unadulterated ice. I looked at Vivian, then at Serena, and finally locked eyes with Brad. I saw them for exactly what they were, parasites. And I knew right then, with absolute certainty, that I was going to financially destroy them all. I did not say another word to them. I brushed past my mother's outstretched arm, unlocked my car, and slid into the luxurious leather driver's seat. The heavy door closed with a solid thud, instantly shutting out the sound of the rain and their toxic, demanding voices. I started the engine, the powerful roar of the exhaust breaking the tense silence of the cemetery. Before I even put the car in drive, I picked up my phone and pressed a single button on my dashboard screen. The call connected after just one ring. "Hello, Miss Jenkins." My assistant's crisp, professional voice came through the car speakers. I stared through the rain-slicked windshield at my family standing in the parking lot. I watched Brad looking incredibly pleased with himself, adjusting his umbrella, and smiling at my mother. "I need you to pull up the confidential files we acquired from the private equity pool last month," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "Locate the high-yield personal debt portfolio belonging to Bradford Sterling." "Yes, ma'am," she replied instantly, the sound of rapid typing echoing over the line. "I have his entire financial history right here. What would you like to do?" I shifted the car into gear, my eyes locked on Brad's smug face in my rearview mirror as I prepared to pull away. "Start the foreclosure process on his trust fund," I commanded, "and freeze every single line of credit attached to his name. Let us see how much of a financial expert he really is when he has absolutely nothing left." I stepped out of the private elevator and the heavy glass doors of CJ Holdings slid open seamlessly. My heels clicked with absolute authority against the dark, imported marble floors as I walked through the sprawling lobby of my firm. The camera would track me here, moving smoothly alongside my confident stride, capturing the sleek and modern aesthetic of the empire I had built from the ground up. I was no longer the grieving daughter standing in the freezing rain. I was the chief executive officer walking into her fortress. CJ Holdings was not just a company to me, it was my armor. When my family constantly cast me aside and told me I was not good enough, I threw myself into the grueling, male-dominated world of corporate finance. I started out analyzing toxic assets and foreclosure data for absolute pennies, working 80-hour weeks while Brad was busy playing golf with his college buddies and pretending to close massive deals. I built an ironclad network. I found the hidden cracks in the financial system, and I learned how to exploit them. Now my firm managed hundreds of millions of dollars in distressed debt. The very people who looked down on me in high society were often the exact same ones secretly begging my company for extensions on their defaulted loans. My executive assistant Maya was already waiting for me at the reception desk. She matched my stride immediately, handing over a sleek silver tablet illuminated with confidential financial reports. "Good afternoon, Miss Jenkins," Maya said, her voice completely professional but carrying a hint of dark amusement. "We have some incredibly interesting developments regarding your brother-in-law. It seems Bradford Sterling has been making some very desperate moves while you were at the cemetery." I pushed open the heavy wooden double doors to my corner office, walking directly over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the bustling Atlanta streets below. "Tell me everything," I commanded, taking off my damp black coat and tossing it onto a leather chair. Maya tapped the screen of her tablet, bringing up a series of banking alerts. "First thing this morning, Brad used a personal connection at your retail bank to place a temporary freeze on your 2 personal checking accounts. He filed an emergency legal injunction claiming those funds are directly tied to the contested family estate. He is operating under the assumption that those accounts hold the entirety of your liquid assets. He genuinely thinks he has completely cut off your cash flow." I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed in the spacious office. The sheer arrogance of the man was only matched by his profound ignorance. My personal checking accounts held roughly $40,000, which was essentially just my pocket change for weekly expenses, like groceries and dry cleaning. Brad was a mid-level financial broker who spent his entire life trying to look rich, so he naturally assumed everyone else kept their entire net worth sitting in a basic retail bank account. He had absolutely no idea that my actual wealth, the millions of dollars I controlled, was safely locked away in offshore trusts, corporate holding accounts, and private equity portfolios that his mediocre team of lawyers could never even hope to find, let alone touch. "He really thinks he has me backed into a corner," I said, walking over to my mahogany desk and sitting down in my high-backed leather chair. "Let him keep thinking that. Do not contest the freeze on those personal accounts. Let the bank hold the $40,000. I want him to feel incredibly confident. I want him to believe he is winning right up until the exact moment the floor collapses beneath him." "Has the foreclosure process on his trust fund been initiated?" "Yes, Mom," Maya confirmed with a sharp nod. "The paperwork is moving through the private channels right now. He will not get the official default notice until we want him to." Before I could give my next order, the private line on my desk phone began to ring loudly. I glanced at the caller identification screen. It was Serena. My sister never called my private office line unless she wanted to make a grand performance out of it. I gestured for Maya to stay in the room and hit the speakerphone button, leaning back comfortably in my chair. "Hello, Serena," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat and entirely unbothered. "Well, well, well," my older sister's voice crackled through the speaker, dripping with a sickeningly sweet tone of false victory. "I just wanted to call and see how my little sister is doing on this gloomy afternoon. Have you started packing your boxes yet, Chloe? I heard you might be having some trouble accessing your money today. Such a terrible shame." I stared at the blinking red light on the phone, feeling nothing but cold pity for the delusional woman on the other end of the line. "You and Brad really think you have accomplished something today, do you not? We are just protecting the family assets from someone who has never truly belonged," Serena snapped back, dropping the sweet act instantly and letting her true venom show. "Brad is a financial genius, Chloe. He knows exactly how to handle people like you. You thought you could just sit in Daddy's massive house forever while the rest of us actually work to build a real legacy. You are completely frozen out now. If you do not have all of your cheap clothes out of that Victorian estate by the end of the week, I am going to call the police and have you physically escorted off the premises for trespassing. I will stand there and watch them throw your belongings onto the front lawn myself." "You are threatening to call the police on your own sister," I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Over a house you never even cared about until you realized you could sell the land to a commercial developer." "It is my house!" Serena yelled, her voice echoing shrilly in my quiet office. "I am the oldest. I am the golden child. I am the one who gave Mom and Dad beautiful grandchildren. I am the one who actually deserves it." "Deserves it," I repeated, letting out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Let us talk about what you deserve, Serena. Let us talk about the $50,000 grand piano Mom and Dad bought you when you were 16 because you swore you were going to be a classical prodigy. You played it exactly twice and then used it as a table to hold your empty wine glasses. Let us talk about the fully funded college account you completely blew through in 3 semesters because you were too busy partying in Miami to actually attend your business classes." "Shut up," Serena hissed, but I was not even close to finished. "I was the one who worked 2 jobs to pay my own way through university," I continued, my voice steady and completely relentless. "I was the one who bought my own first car while you crashed 3 brand new convertibles that Dad had to quietly replace to save your reputation. You have spent your entire life as the favorite child, swiping credit cards you did not pay for, living in luxury homes you did not earn, and pretending to be wildly successful while your husband secretly drowns in corporate debt." I paused for a fraction of a second, letting the weight of my words sink in before delivering the final blow. "And let us talk about the last 2 years of Dad's life, Serena. Let us talk about how you and Brad suddenly decided to take a month-long luxury vacation to the Amalfi Coast the exact same week Dad started his aggressive chemotherapy. You posted pictures drinking expensive champagne on a yacht while I was sitting in sterile hospital waiting rooms, holding his hand while he threw up from the radiation treatments. You did not even visit him for his final birthday because you told Mom the hospital smell made you too depressed. You abandoned him when he needed you most, and now you want to swoop in and claim the house he suffered in. You absolutely disgust me." There was a heavy, suffocated silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing rapidly, completely flustered that I was not crying, begging for mercy, or apologizing like I used to when we were kids. Serena was a classic bully. And like all bullies, she had absolutely no idea how to handle someone who refused to cower in fear. "You always were a bitter, jealous little girl," Serena finally spat out, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage. "You are just jealous that Brad and I have a perfect, wealthy life, and you have absolutely no one to love you." "I have my peace," I replied simply. "Something you and Brad clearly cannot afford." Serena let out a sharp, dramatic sigh, clearly trying to quickly pivot the conversation and regain the upper hand. She realized her legal threats and insults were not working on me anymore, so she fell back on the only other weapon she had left in her arsenal: social manipulation. "Whatever, Chloe," she said, her voice suddenly switching back to that fake, sickly sweet tone from the beginning of the call. "I am not going to let your miserable attitude ruin my day or my upcoming holiday. In fact, despite how horribly you are behaving right now, Brad and I have decided to take the absolute high road. We are hosting Thanksgiving dinner at our mansion in Buckhead this Thursday. The entire extended family is flying in from out of state. All the aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone will be there. Mom wants you there so we can present a united front for the relatives." I narrowed my eyes, staring intensely at the phone on my desk. Thanksgiving was only 2 days away. Inviting me to a massive family gathering right after serving me with eviction papers and freezing my bank accounts was not an olive branch. It was a carefully constructed, highly calculated trap. Serena and Brad wanted an audience. They wanted to publicly humiliate me in front of our entire African-American extended family, to paint me as the crazy, ungrateful sister who was stealing from the estate, and to cement their status as the new, generous heads of the Jenkins family legacy. They probably planned to ambush me with more legal paperwork while surrounded by judgmental relatives who would automatically side with them. We are going to have catered food, expensive wine, and a beautiful evening, Serena continued, clearly enjoying the sound of her own voice again. Consider it your last decent meal before you have to figure out how to pay for your own groceries with frozen bank accounts. Be there at 6 o'clock sharp. Try to wear something nice for once so you do not embarrass us. Any normal person would have hung up the phone immediately. Any normal person would have blocked her number, hired a vicious defense attorney, and completely ignored the invitation to a holiday dinner that was explicitly designed to be a public execution. But I was not a normal person, and I was not playing defense anymore. I looked up at Maya, who was watching me with wide eyes, fully aware of the toxic family dynamics at play. I smiled. It was a slow, predatory smile that did not quite reach my eyes. I knew exactly what kind of trap I was walking into, and it was precisely the stage I needed to execute my final plan. Thank you so much for the lovely invitation, Serena, I said, my voice dripping with dark amusement. I would not miss this family Thanksgiving for the absolute world. I will see you on Thursday. I reached over and pressed the silver button to end the call before she could say another word. The executive office fell completely silent again. Maya cleared her throat gently, shifting her weight. Are you really going to that dinner, Miss Jenkins? It sounds like they are planning a literal firing squad for you. I picked up a gold pen from my desk, twirling it between my fingers. Oh, they are definitely planning a firing squad, Maya, I replied, turning my chair to look back out over the sprawling city of Atlanta. But they are completely forgetting one crucial detail. They are bringing blank cartridges to a war, and I am the one who owns the entire armory. Let them prepare their turkey and practice their little speeches. Thanksgiving is going to be incredibly memorable this year. Thursday evening arrived with a bitter chill in the air. I pulled my sleek black sedan into the winding, perfectly manicured driveway of my sister and brother-in-law's massive estate in Buckhead. The driveway was already packed with the expensive luxury vehicles of my extended family. I sat in my car for a moment, looking up at the towering brick facade and the brightly lit windows. I could see the silhouettes of my aunts, uncles, and cousins moving around inside, laughing, drinking, and completely oblivious to the war that was about to unfold. I smoothed down the fabric of my emerald green designer dress, grabbed my leather clutch, and walked up the stone steps to the heavy oak front door. The moment I stepped inside, the loud, joyful chatter of the family gathering dipped into a noticeable, incredibly uncomfortable hush. The air was thick with the delicious familiar smells of baked macaroni and cheese, collard greens, sweet potato pie, and roasted turkey. It was a classic African-American Thanksgiving feast, but the atmosphere in the room felt more like a courtroom waiting for the guilty defendant to arrive. My mother, Vivian, gave me a stiff, disapproving nod from across the room. My aunts immediately started whispering behind their wine glasses, their eyes darting up and down my outfit. Serena, wearing a ridiculous sparkling cocktail dress that looked wildly out of place for a family dinner, plastered on a fake, overly bright smile, and walked over to greet me loudly enough for everyone to hear. I am so glad you finally decided to show up, Chloe, Serena said, kissing the air next to my cheek to avoid ruining her makeup. We were all starting to worry you were going to hide in your apartment all night and ruin the holiday. Come get a plate before the men eat absolutely everything. I smiled back, a polite, chilling smile that gave absolutely nothing away. Thank you for the warm welcome, Serena, I replied smoothly. I walked past her into the massive formal dining room and took the single empty seat left for me at the far end of the long mahogany table. The table was practically groaning under the weight of the extravagant food, crystal glasses, and expensive silver platters. Brad was standing proudly at the head of the table, wearing a crisp, tailored shirt with the sleeves rolled up, holding a large carving knife and a heavy silver serving fork. He looked around the room, making intense eye contact with all of my black relatives, soaking in their undivided attention like he was some kind of royalty holding court in his castle. Before we dig into this incredible meal, Brad announced, his loud, booming voice echoing off the high ceilings and demanding absolute silence, I want to take a moment to say a few words about family. The room fell completely silent. All eyes turned to Brad. He puffed out his chest, leaning his knuckles on the table and looking deeply serious, practicing a look of profound sorrow that he had probably rehearsed in the mirror all morning. This has been an incredibly difficult year for the Jenkins family. Losing our father was a massive, devastating blow to all of us. But in times of crisis, real leaders have to step up. When I married Serena, I did not just marry her. I married into this beautiful, strong family. And I made a silent promise to protect the Jenkins legacy at all costs. He paused, letting his words hang in the air so everyone could properly admire his supposed nobility. It was the ultimate white savior performance, a perfectly calculated act designed to manipulate the room, and my relatives were eating it up like candy. My uncles were nodding in solemn agreement, impressed by his corporate jargon. My mother looked at him with pure, unfiltered adoration, tears welling up in her eyes as if he were a saint descended from heaven to rescue us all from poverty. As you all know, there has been some unfortunate tension lately regarding the family estate, Brad continued, shifting his gaze directly down the length of the table to lock eyes with me. His voice hardened, losing the fake warmth. Property taxes, maintenance costs, and probate legalities are incredibly complex issues. It is not something just anyone can handle, especially someone without a proper financial background. To secure the generational wealth of this family, I am personally taking on the heavy financial burden of managing the estate. I am using my professional expertise and my firm's resources to make sure the Jenkins name is protected forever. He snapped his fingers, and Serena immediately pulled a thick legal document from the wooden sideboard. She walked it down the length of the table, her heels clicking loudly against the hardwood floor, and placed it directly next to my dinner plate. She then reached into her pocket and placed a freshly printed cashier check right on top of the legal papers. "We do not want any bad blood tonight, Chloe," Brad said, his voice dripping with unbearable condescension as he pointed the carving knife toward me. "We want to be generous. We want to help you. That is a check for $50,000. It is more than enough money for you to get a fresh start, pay off whatever little debts you have accumulated, and find a nice, affordable place to live. All you have to do is sign that waiver, officially relinquishing any and all legal claims to the Victorian house, and we can all enjoy this Thanksgiving as a united, happy family." The sheer audacity of the ambush was breathtaking. He had literally turned a sacred family holiday into a hostile hostage negotiation. The heavy silence in the dining room pressed down on me from all sides. I could feel the harsh, judgmental stares of my aunts, uncles, and cousins burning into the side of my head. They were all waiting for me to break. They fully expected me to be intimidated by the dense legal paperwork, overwhelmed by the intense public pressure, and desperate enough to snatch up the $50,000 like a starving dog, finally getting a scrap from the master table. My mother cleared her throat loudly from the other end of the table, shattering the quiet. "Sign the paper right now, Chloe," she commanded, her voice sharp and unrelenting, echoing her usual disappointment in me. "Your brother-in-law is being incredibly generous to you after the disgraceful way you have behaved since the funeral. Do not embarrass us tonight. Take the money, sign the document, and let this family heal." I slowly looked down at the legal document, reading the bold print of the waiver, and then shifted my eyes to the check. $50,000. It was an absolutely insulting, laughable amount of money for a historic property worth well over $4 million. But to them, to people who only understood the illusion of wealth, it was a massive fortune they thought I desperately needed to survive. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of the blazing anger churning in my stomach. Instead, I calmly reached into my leather clutch and pulled out my heavy gold Mont Blanc fountain pen. A collective sigh of relief seemed to ripple through the massive dining room. Serena smirked openly, crossing her arms in absolute triumph as she looked back at her husband. Brad stood a little taller, a look of profound, sickening satisfaction washing over his smug face. They really thought they had won. They truly believed they had finally broken my spirit, humiliated me in front of our entire family, and bought my permanent submission for pennies on the dollar. I uncapped the heavy gold pen with a soft, distinct click. I rested my hand on the paper, my fingers hovering right over the designated signature line. Then, I stopped. I deliberately froze my hand in midair. I looked up from the document and let my eyes slowly wander over the extravagant spread of food on the table, examining the silver platters, the crystal wine decanters, and finally letting my sharp gaze settle on the massive, perfectly roasted turkey sitting right in front of Brad. "This really is a beautiful spread you put together, Serena," I said, my voice perfectly calm and conversational, slicing effortlessly through the heavy tension in the room. "You must have spared absolutely no expense to host all of us tonight. The private catering, the vintage wine, this magnificent turkey. It all looks incredibly expensive." Serena blinked rapidly, clearly thrown off guard by the sudden bizarre change in topic. "Well, yes, of course," she replied defensively, her fake smile faltering. "We only provide the absolute best for our family." I smiled, leaning back comfortably in my chair and tapping the gold cap of my pen rhythmically against the solid mahogany table. "It is fascinating, really, because I'm just sitting here trying to figure out how exactly you managed to pay for all of this." Brad's confident, victorious smile vanished instantly. His knuckles turned white as his grip on the carving knife tightened. "What are you talking about, Chloe?" he demanded, his voice losing its smooth corporate edge. "Just sign the document so we can eat our dinner." I kept my eyes locked dead on his face, my voice remaining completely even, but projecting clearly into every single corner of the dining room so that no one would miss a single syllable. "I am talking about your platinum credit card, Brad, the shiny one you tried to use at the high-end grocery store in Buckhead at exactly 9 o'clock this morning to pick up this very turkey." I heard it was quite the spectacular public scene. The dining room became so unnaturally quiet, you could hear the subtle hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Nobody dared to breathe. My aunts froze with their forks halfway to their mouths. The teenage cashier swiped the card 3 times. "Did she not?" I continued, tilting my head slightly as I watched the color rapidly begin to drain from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. "And then the store manager had to come over and quietly explain to you that your account was completely maxed out and frozen for non-payment. You had to leave your cart right there in the checkout lane, walk outside in shame, and call Serena to come bail you out with her debit card. A debit card that, ironically enough, is funded by a high-interest credit line you secretly took out in my mother's name 6 months ago." A collective, shocked gasp swept across the long table. Several of my aunts slammed their wine glasses down, spilling red liquid onto the pristine white tablecloth. My mother whipped her head around to look at Serena, her eyes wide with sudden, terrifying panic. But Serena was too busy staring at me in absolute, paralyzing horror to offer any reassurance. "So before I sign over a $4 million family estate to a so-called financial genius," I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, mocking whisper that cut deeper than any knife, "I just want to know if this $50,000 check is actually going to clear the bank tomorrow morning. Or is it going to bounce exactly like your grocery bill did today?" Brad turned a vibrant, unnatural shade of beet red. The veins in his neck bulged visibly against his tight white collar. The carving knife in his hand shook violently as he stared down at me, completely stripped of his arrogant white savior facade, exposed in front of the entire African-American family as an absolute pathetic fraud. The heavy silence in the dining room hung in the air like thick smoke. Brad opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water, desperately trying to formulate a coherent sentence, but his brain was completely short-circuiting. He looked at Serena for help, but Serena was staring at her own plate, entirely paralyzed by the sudden brutal collapse of their wealthy facade. My aunts exchanged wide-eyed glances of pure shock. Uncle Marcus slowly lowered his fork, his face settling into a mask of deep, undeniable disappointment. The polished, perfect image Brad had spent years carefully constructing had just been shattered into a million irreparable pieces in front of everyone who mattered. But before Brad could stammer out a pathetic, fumbling excuse about banking errors or stolen identities, a heavy mahogany chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor at the other end of the table. My mother, Vivian, stood up. Her face was contorted with a kind of raw, unfiltered fury I had not seen since I was a teenager. She did not direct her anger at the arrogant white man who had just been exposed for secretly maxing out credit cards and plunging their lives into debt. No, she directed every single ounce of her blinding rage squarely at me. She marched down the length of the long dining table, her heavy footsteps echoing in the dead quiet room, her eyes locked on me like a predator. She stopped right next to my chair. I did not flinch. I did not look away. Her hand came down across my face with a blinding flash of pain. It was a vicious, open-handed strike that violently snapped my head to the side. The sharp crack of the slap echoed off the high ceilings like a gunshot, causing several of my younger cousins to jump in their seats and gasp. I felt the immediate burning sting on my skin, followed almost instantly by the warm, metallic taste of blood pooling in the corner of my mouth. The heavy diamond ring on her finger had caught my lower lip, slicing it open. "How dare you!" Vivian screamed, her voice completely unhinged, spraying small drops of saliva as she leaned aggressively over my chair. "How dare you come into this beautiful home, eat the expensive food your sister graciously prepared for you, and spew these disgusting, jealous lies to humiliate your brother-in-law in front of our entire family?" "They are not lies, Mom," I said quietly, keeping my head completely still as I looked up into her furious, manic eyes. "And deep down, you know it. You have always been a vicious, ungrateful brat," Vivian shouted, entirely ignoring the reality of the situation. Her denial was so incredibly deep it bordered on sheer madness. She began to pace back and forth behind my chair, waving her arms frantically as she addressed the stunned African-American relatives sitting frozen around the long table. "She has been exactly like this for 10 years," Vivian announced to the room, desperately trying to rewrite the narrative and paint me as the villain. "When she was in high school, she was nothing but a rebellious nightmare. She refused to go to the community events I planned. She refused to dress the way I told her to. She never appreciated a single sacrifice Serena and I made to give her a good life. She just sat in her room reading her stupid books, judging all of us, acting like she was somehow better than her own flesh and blood." I let her rant. I let her dig her own grave right in front of the people she cared about impressing the most. "You have always been utterly obsessed with trying to make your sister look bad," Vivian continued, her voice growing more shrill and desperate with every single word. "You were obsessed with hoarding your father's attention when he was alive, and now you are obsessed with hoarding his money when he is dead. You think you are a victim, Chloe. You think you are some kind of noble martyr just because you stayed behind while we went on a family vacation." And there it was, the crack in her armor, the accidental, fatal slip of the tongue. The massive dining room went unnaturally still. "Vacation," Uncle Marcus repeated, his deep, booming voice cutting cleanly through Vivian's hysterical rant, his thick eyebrows pulled together in deep confusion and growing horror. "Vivian!" Theodore was dying. He was undergoing intensive daily chemotherapy that entire summer. "You told all of us you took Serena to a specialized grief retreat in California to cope with the heavy trauma of his illness." Vivian's face suddenly went completely pale. The manic energy drained out of her body as she realized exactly what she had just said. But it was far too late to take the words back. The absolute truth was already spilling out into the open, ugly, undeniable, and impossible to hide. "A grief retreat," I said, letting out a dark, mocking laugh that made my bleeding lips sting sharply. "Is that what you told the family, Mom? A grief retreat?" I turned my head to look directly at Uncle Marcus and my aunts, raising my voice so they could hear the absolute truth. "They went on a luxury vacation to Europe. They spent a month drinking expensive vintage wine in Paris and taking private luxury boat tours in Rome." I turned my piercing gaze back to my mother, my eyes completely devoid of any warmth or forgiveness. Dad was actively losing his hair. He could barely keep a tiny glass of water down. He was scared. He was in agonizing pain, and he begged you to stay with him. But you told him his hospital room was too depressing for you. You said you and Serena needed to protect your peace and enjoy yourselves. You left a dying man completely alone in a sterile room while you maxed out his credit cards buying designer handbags in Italy. I was the one who slept in that uncomfortable plastic hospital chair every single night for a month. I was the one who held a cold washcloth to his sweating forehead while he cried for his wife. Vivian trembled violently. The aunts at the table were now staring at her with pure, unfiltered disgust. Uncle Marcus looked absolutely sick to his stomach, pushing his plate of food away from him. The carefully constructed image of the devoted, mourning widow was entirely incinerated in a matter of seconds. "Shut your mouth!" Vivian shrieked, her voice cracking as she slammed both of her hands down on the dining table, rattling the expensive crystal glasses. He was miserable to be around. Do you have any idea what it is like to be married to a man who is actively dying and constantly complaining? We needed a break. Serena deserved to have one last happy summer before the inevitable funeral. We did absolutely nothing wrong. The sheer desperation in her voice was pathetic to witness. She looked frantically around the table, silently begging for someone, anyone, to validate her horrific choices. But nobody said a single word. The entire extended family just stared at her in horrified silence. Even Brad had the sense to step back and look at the floor, realizing the sinking ship was taking on water far too fast for him to save. Vivian turned her manic, tear-filled eyes back to me, her breathing heavy and ragged. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You are toxic, Chloe. Are toxic. You are an absolute cancer to this family. I am giving you one last chance to fix the terrible mess you just made tonight. You are going to pick up that gold pen, and you are going to sign that legal waiver right now. You are going to sign over that house to your sister, you are going to take the $50,000, and you are going to apologize to Brad for your disgusting behavior. And if I do not," I asked calmly, not breaking eye contact, "then you are no longer my daughter," Vivian spat out, her face twisted with a level of pure hatred I had never fully comprehended until this exact moment. "I will cut you off completely. You will be dead to me. You will never be welcome at another holiday, another wedding, or another family gathering ever again. You will be entirely alone in this world, exactly like you deserve to be. Sign the paper, Chloe." The silence in the room was absolute. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see if the ultimate threat of total family abandonment would finally be the thing to break my spirit. To be completely exiled from the community network, from your own flesh and blood, is a terrifying concept for anyone. Vivian was playing her absolute last card, banking entirely on my deep-seated childhood fear of being left completely alone and unloved. But she forgot that I had already learned exactly how to survive without her a very long time ago. I looked down at the heavy gold fountain pen resting next to the legal document. I looked at the printed cashier check for $50,000. And then, I slowly lifted my hand to my mouth. I wiped the warm blood from my split lip with my thumb, examining the bright red smear on my dark skin for a brief second before reaching for my leather clutch. I did not pick up the pen. I did not touch the legal waiver. Instead, I opened my purse and pulled out a single, crisp $50 bill. I smoothed it out perfectly and placed it gently on top of the pristine white tablecloth, right next to my untouched dinner plate. "That should cover the cost of my meal," I said, my voice eerily calm, carrying a deadly sense of finality that echoed clearly through the massive dining room. I picked up my clutch, pushed my heavy chair back, and stood up to my full height. I smoothed the skirt of my emerald green dress, completely ignoring Serena and Brad. I looked directly into my mother's panicked, furious eyes. She had expected me to crumble. She had expected me to cry and beg for her forgiveness, but all she saw in my eyes was a vast, frozen wasteland where my love and respect for her used to reside. "Remember tonight, Mom?" I said, my words dropping like heavy stones in the quiet room. "When Brad finally goes to prison for financial fraud. When the bank comes to foreclose on the home you are living in because he secretly used your property as collateral for his massive debts. When you lose absolutely everything you have ever valued, and you finally realize exactly who you threw away to protect a pathetic illusion. Do not come looking for me." I turned around and walked out of the formal dining room. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, deliberate, powerful stride of a woman who had just won the war. The heavy oak front door clicked shut behind me, sealing my toxic family inside their own collapsing world, and I stepped out into the crisp, refreshing autumn night, feeling completely and utterly free. The days following the catastrophic Thanksgiving dinner were predictably chaotic and filled with venom. My phone literally did not stop ringing for 48 hours straight. My mother made good on her vicious threat to cut me off, but she did not just stop at ignoring me. She initiated a massive, highly coordinated smear campaign across our entire extended family. Vivian called every single aunt, uncle, and distant cousin who had attended the dinner, twisting the narrative with the skill of a seasoned politician. Brad played his part perfectly, utilizing his white tears and corporate victimhood to convince the African American relatives that my accusations at the dinner table were nothing but malicious, jealous lies. Brad told my Uncle Marcus that his credit card was only declined at the grocery store because of a random bank security freeze triggered by a fraudulent charge in another state. He told my aunts that I was a bitter, lonely woman, desperately trying to steal Serena's rightful inheritance because I was secretly drowning in massive debt. And tragically, most of my relatives chose to believe him. They chose the comfortable, familiar lie of the wealthy white savior over the harsh, undeniable truth of the independent black woman. My own flesh and blood decided it was easier to cast me as the crazy, ungrateful sister rather than admit they had been worshipping a complete fraud. I let their calls go to voicemail. I did not waste a single breath trying to defend myself to people who were utterly committed to misunderstanding me. Then came the aggressive legal retaliation. 2 days after I walked out of that dining room, I was leaving my favorite downtown coffee shop holding an iced latte. A man in a plain gray suit suddenly stepped directly into my path, blocking the sidewalk. "Are you Chloe Jenkins?" he asked in a flat, monotone voice. I nodded slowly, already knowing exactly what was about to happen. He shoved a thick, heavy manila envelope against my chest and immediately turned around to walk away. "You have been served," he muttered over his shoulder as he disappeared into the crowd. I stood on the bustling Atlanta sidewalk and opened the envelope. It was a formal court summons to the Fulton County courthouse. Brad had officially filed the emergency legal injunction to have me forcefully evicted from the Victorian family estate. Attached to the eviction notice was a massive lawsuit demanding $300,000 in what his lawyers boldly categorized as back rent and property damages. Brad thought dragging me into a public courtroom with his expensive legal team would finally break my spirit. He wanted to drain my financial resources, exhaust me with endless legal fees, and publicly destroy my reputation. He wanted to watch me beg for mercy in front of a judge. I calmly finished my coffee, walked to my car, and handed the entire stack of paperwork straight to my lead defense attorney with a single, simple instruction: let him proceed. But Brad was not the only one lashing out in a desperate bid for control. Serena was absolutely fuming. Her fragile, carefully constructed ego had been brutally bruised at her own dinner party, and she desperately needed someone to punish. Since she could not legally kick me out of the Victorian house yet, she decided to attack the only other thing she thought I truly valued: my livelihood. Serena had absolutely no idea that I was the founder and chief executive officer of CJ Holdings. Despite my success, I never bragged about my business to my family because I knew they would either try to take credit for it or ask me for money. To Serena, I was just a regular, mid-level corporate employee taking orders from a strict boss in a cubicle. So, fueled by blinding rage and her signature sense of entitlement, she formulated a brilliant plan to go to my workplace, get me fired, and leave me completely destitute. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Serena marched through the heavy revolving glass doors of my company building in downtown Atlanta. She was wearing massive designer sunglasses indoors, carrying an oversized luxury handbag, and acting like she personally owned the entire skyscraper. She walked straight past the waiting area, marched right up to the polished marble reception desk, and slammed her hand down loudly enough to startle the other guests in the elegant corporate lobby. The front desk receptionist, a highly trained professional named Sarah, looked up with a calm, polite smile. Serena did not even bother to say hello. She immediately demanded to speak with the general manager, the president, or whoever was in charge of the company. She announced loudly to the entire lobby that they were employing a thief, a liar, and a scam artist. She screamed that Chloe Jenkins was a toxic employee who was actively trying to ruin her family, and she declared that she was not leaving the premises until I was permanently terminated and escorted out of the building with my belongings in a cardboard box. Sarah did not panic. She calmly picked up her phone and alerted my executive assistant, Maya. I was sitting in my corner penthouse office, right in the middle of a high-stakes conference call with a commercial real estate developer, when Maya quietly stepped in and handed me a note. The note simply said, "Your sister is having a massive public meltdown in the lobby and is demanding to speak to your manager." I could not help but laugh out loud. I muted my conference call, looked at Maya, and told her to go downstairs and handle the situation. I instructed her to call building security and have my sister permanently banned from the property. Maya rode the private elevator down to the ground floor, carrying a thick stack of urgent financial documents I needed to review. When the heavy silver doors opened, Serena spotted her approaching the desk. Serena immediately escalated her tantrum, pointing her manicured finger at Maya and yelling that the company was going to face a massive public relations nightmare if they did not fire me immediately. She was causing such a severe disturbance that several employees from other departments had stopped walking to watch the bizarre spectacle unfold. Maya did not flinch. She did not even raise her voice to argue. She simply gave a subtle nod to the two massive building security guards standing near the front entrance. The guards walked over quickly, their faces completely serious, and asked Serena to lower her voice and leave the building. When Serena arrogantly refused and tried to push past them to reach the elevators, the guards firmly grabbed her arms to physically escort her outside. "Do not touch me!" Serena shrieked, beginning to thrash and struggle wildly against the two large men. "Do you know who my husband is? I will have you all fired." She swung her heavy luxury handbag in a blind fit of rage, accidentally hitting Maya's arm in the process. The sudden impact caused the top file from Maya's stack of documents to slip out of her hands and slap loudly onto the polished marble floor. It was a bright red, heavy-duty legal folder. The bold black text printed across the front label was incredibly large and utterly impossible to miss. It read, "Bradford Sterling Notice of Default and Foreclosure." Serena stopped struggling for a fraction of a second. She froze, her chest heaving, and her blue eyes locked directly onto the bright red folder lying on the ground. She saw her husband's full name. She saw the terrifying word, default. She saw the official seal of a private equity firm. A normal, rational person would have instantly paused. A normal person would have stopped yelling, bent down, and realized that something incredibly dangerous and completely devastating was happening right under their nose. But Serena was not a rational person. She was so entirely consumed by her own toxic arrogance, so blinded by her desperate need to see me humiliated and fired, that her brain simply refused to process the massive warning sign sitting right at her feet. She probably assumed I had stolen his identity to create fake documents, or that it was just another pathetic attempt to make myself look important. She scoffed loudly, kicked the red folder completely out of her way with her expensive stiletto heel, and went right back to screaming insults at the receptionist. The security guards finally lost their patience. They literally dragged her backward through the revolving doors, her designer shoes skidding across the floor, and tossed her unceremoniously out onto the wet, busy sidewalk in front of dozens of onlookers. Maya calmly bent down, picked up the red folder, dusted off the cover, and brought it straight up to my office. When she told me exactly what had happened, we both shared a long, satisfying laugh looking out over the city. My sister had literally kicked away the only warning she was ever going to get. Serena and Brad were exhausting all of their energy throwing wild temper tantrums, completely unaware that the ground beneath them was actively crumbling into dust. They were so intensely focused on trying to ruin my life that they completely forgot to protect their own. The ultimate showdown was rapidly approaching, and Brad was starting to feel the intense pressure of his own lies catching up to him. The very next morning, at exactly 5:00 at dawn, my cell phone vibrated violently on my nightstand. The caller identification showed Brad's personal number. I did not answer it. I simply rolled over in my warm bed and let it go straight to voicemail. When I finally woke up an hour later, I brewed a fresh cup of coffee, walked out onto my penthouse balcony, and listened to the recording. I heard Brad's voice coming through the speaker. He sounded completely exhausted, bitterly angry, and incredibly unhinged. He had clearly been awake all night, drinking heavily and letting his dark rage boil over into pure, concentrated panic. "Listen to me carefully," Brad hissed into the phone, his words slurring slightly in the early morning darkness. "You think you are so incredibly smart. You think you can embarrass me in front of my own family and just get away with it. Enjoy your pathetic little office job while it lasts, Chloe. I will see you at the Fulton County courthouse tomorrow morning. I am going to strip you of absolutely everything you have in court, you bitch." I deleted the voicemail. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I did not feel any anxiety or panic about the looming court date. I only felt a cold, sharp sense of absolute anticipation. I turned my back on the glowing Atlanta skyline, walked into my massive walk-in closet, and changed into a comfortable cashmere sweater and dark slacks. I grabbed my car keys from the kitchen island. I had one final, crucial stop to make before the ultimate showdown in front of the judge tomorrow morning. I drove my car out of the bustling city center, watching the dense skyscrapers slowly give way to the sprawling, old money suburbs, until I finally reached the massive wrought iron gates of my late father's Victorian estate. The house was completely silent when I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped inside. It was a stark, peaceful contrast to the chaotic, never-ending screaming matches my mother and sister constantly orchestrated whenever they were in the same room. I walked past the grand sweeping staircase and the formal living room with its expensive antique furniture. My footsteps echoed softly on the original dark hardwood floors as I headed straight down the long, shadowed hallway toward the back of the house. I opened the heavy double doors to my father's private study. The room still smelled faintly of his favorite pipe tobacco, old leather-bound books, and peppermint. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, keeping the room wrapped in quiet shadows. It was exactly as he had left it the day he was moved into the hospital for the very last time. The camera would move in slowly here, a deliberate, slow push across the intricate Persian rug as I walked behind his massive, hand-carved cherry wood desk. I reached up and gently moved a framed oil painting of a maritime landscape to the side, revealing a sleek digital wall safe hidden directly behind the canvas. I typed in the 6-digit passcode. It was my father's birthday. The heavy steel door clicked loudly and swung open. Inside the dark metal box, there was no expensive jewelry. There were no stacks of gold bullion or hidden family heirlooms. There were only thick, heavy stacks of paper bound tightly by thick rubber bands. I reached in and pulled them all out, placing them squarely in the center of the leather desk pad. They were medical bills, hundreds and hundreds of them, pages upon pages of itemized hospital charges, aggressive private chemotherapy sessions, specialized radiation treatments, experimental pharmaceutical trials, and round-the-clock private nursing care. I slowly flipped through the towering stacks, tracing my finger over the bright red ink of the stamps that marked every single page. Paid in full. Over the course of 3 brutal, exhausting years, I had quietly liquidated my own personal investments to pay over $2.5 million in out-of-pocket medical expenses to keep my father comfortable in fighting. I did it entirely in secret. Looking at those massive stacks of bills brought me right back to the darkest afternoon of my life. I was sitting in my corporate office 3 years ago when my father first walked in with his terrifying stage 4 cancer diagnosis. I remember my assistant, Maya, standing quietly by the door with tears welling up in her eyes as he handed me the horrific projected costs of the specialized treatments he desperately needed to survive. He looked so incredibly tired that day, but his mind was as sharp and pragmatic as ever. He knew exactly who he had married. He knew exactly how he and Vivian had raised Serena. He sat across from my desk, his hands trembling slightly as he looked at the numbers. "Chloe," he had said, his voice raspy but carrying a heavy, heartbreaking truth. "If your mother finds out this treatment is going to cost millions of dollars and drain the family estate, she will not authorize it. She will put me in a cheap, state-run hospice facility and wait for me to die so she can keep the house, the cars, and the high-society lifestyle she loves so much. Serena will agree with her. They love the image of my wealth far more than they love me." He was absolutely right, and it broke his heart to finally admit it out loud to his youngest daughter. He refused to let them strip him of his dignity in his final years. He refused to die in a sterile, underfunded facility just so his wife and eldest daughter could continue buying designer handbags and pretending to be Atlanta royalty. So, we made a strictly confidential, legally bulletproof business arrangement. My father voluntarily sold the Victorian estate directly to my private equity firm, CJ Holdings, in a completely airtight cash transaction. I bought the house for a flat $3 million. We used that exact cash to establish a secure, hidden offshore trust fund dedicated solely to paying for his private cancer treatments and hospice care. We filed the transfer of title under a corporate shield, ensuring his name was safely removed from the public property records. On paper, my father was no longer the legal owner of the massive property. He officially became a tenant, leasing the house back from my company for exactly $1 a month. Vivian and Serena lived in that sprawling mansion for 3 entire years, walking down the grand staircases and hosting their fancy dinner parties, completely oblivious to the fact that they were literally living under my roof. They thought they were the wealthy queens of the castle, but they were essentially just my unpaying guests. They never once questioned how the massive medical bills were miraculously taken care of. They just assumed his basic health insurance covered everything, because digging any deeper would have required them to actually care about his day-to-day suffering. They took their luxury vacations to Europe, bought their expensive clothes, and complained about the depressing hospital smell whenever they bothered to visit. Meanwhile, I systematically bought the ground right out from under their expensive shoes to save his life. I stood in the quiet study and picked up the massive stack of paid medical bills, along with the original, notarized bill of sale for the Victorian property. I placed them carefully into a sleek black leather briefcase. These documents were the ultimate undeniable truth. They were the absolute proof of my father's desperate sacrifice, my silent loyalty, and the blinding, pathetic greed of the rest of my family. Brad thought he was going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow and wave an outdated piece of paper to take my home. He genuinely believed his white entitlement and corporate arrogance were enough to steal my property. He was about to walk directly into a legal slaughterhouse. Just as I snapped the heavy brass locks on the briefcase shut, the front door of the estate opened and closed in the distance. I heard the sharp, distinct click of sensible heels walking quickly down the hardwood hallway toward the back of the house. Maya stepped into the doorway of the study, holding a pristine, sealed red legal folder tightly against her chest. She looked at the empty safe on the wall, and then looked directly at the black briefcase in my hands. Her usually strict, professional expression broke into a sharp, incredibly dangerous smile. "Boss," she reported, her voice echoing perfectly in the quiet, shadowed room. "Court is tomorrow morning at 9. I just received the final confirmation from our private legal network. All legal procedures to foreclose on Brad's house are officially complete." The next morning arrived with a sharp, biting chill that seemed to cut right through the bustling streets of downtown Atlanta. I parked my car in the secure garage adjacent to the Fulton County courthouse, taking a moment to sit in the quiet luxury of my vehicle before stepping out into the cold. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I was wearing my custom-tailored charcoal gray suit, a crisp white silk blouse, and a pair of simple diamond stud earrings. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, unforgiving bun. I looked exactly like what I was, a woman who controlled millions of dollars in corporate assets. But as I walked toward the massive, imposing concrete structure of the courthouse, I knew I had to completely suppress that powerful energy for just a little while longer. I needed to play a very specific role this morning. I needed to play the defeated, terrified victim. The security line at the main entrance was long and frustrating, but I navigated it with practiced patience. I took the heavy brass elevator up to the 4th floor, where the probate and estate hearings were held. The long, echoing hallway outside courtroom 4B was brightly lit by harsh fluorescent bulbs, smelling faintly of cheap industrial floor cleaner and stale coffee. I found an empty spot on one of the uncomfortable, hard wooden benches lined up against the pale yellow wall and sat down. I placed my leather clutch on my lap, crossed my ankles, and waited. It did not take long for the circus to arrive. I heard them long before I actually saw them. The loud, arrogant braying of confident men echoing down the marble corridor. Brad came walking around the corner surrounded by his legal team. He had hired 3 extremely expensive, slick white lawyers from one of the top corporate firms in the city. They walked in a tight formation, taking up the entire width of the hallway, forcing other people to step aside to let them pass. They were laughing loudly at some joke one of the lawyers had just made, aggressively slapping each other on the back. They carried slim, expensive Italian leather briefcases and wore tailored suits that probably cost more than most people's cars. Brad was right in the center of the pack, absolutely glowing with unearned confidence. He looked well-rested and incredibly smug, walking with his chest puffed out like a conquering king returning from a victorious battle. He genuinely believed he was less than an hour away from securing a $4 million property. Trailing slightly behind the pack of men was my sister, Serena. She was treating the solemn courthouse hallway like her own personal fashion runway. She wore a skin-tight, violently bright cobalt blue designer dress that was completely inappropriate for a legal proceeding, paired with massive black sunglasses that she wore indoors just to make sure everyone knew she felt important. Her high heels clicked obnoxiously loud against the marble floor. Serena spotted me sitting alone on the wooden bench almost immediately. A cruel, predatory smile stretched across her face. She took off her sunglasses, handed them to Brad, and deliberately strutted over to where I was sitting. She stopped right in front of me, planting her hands on her hips and looking down at me as if I were a piece of trash someone had accidentally tracked in on their shoe. "Well, well, well," Serena said, her voice dripping with venom and entirely too loud for the quiet hallway. "Look who actually decided to show up. I was taking bets with Brad on whether you would even have the guts to face us today, or if you would just run away and hide like the coward you have always been." I did not say a word. I did not look up into her eyes. Instead, I carefully hunched my shoulders forward just a fraction of an inch. I looked down at my hands resting on my clutch, deliberately pressing my fingers together so my knuckles turned slightly white. I wanted to project absolute insecurity. I needed her to think she was completely winning this psychological warfare. "Is that really the suit you decided to wear to your own eviction?" Serena continued, letting out a sharp, mocking laugh that caused a few passing strangers to turn and stare. You look so tense, Chloe. You look exhausted. I guess realizing you're about to lose the only valuable thing you have ever had your hands on will do that to a person. I really hope you spent the weekend packing your bags, because the judge is going to sign those papers today, and I am not giving you a single extra minute to get your cheap junk out of my new house. I kept my eyes glued to the scuffed linoleum floor near the toes of her designer shoes. I let my silence act as a vacuum, sucking in all of her toxic arrogance and inflating her ego to the absolute maximum limit. It was incredibly difficult to sit there and absorb her disrespect without immediately tearing her down, but I knew the payoff waiting inside that courtroom would be worth every single second of this pathetic performance. When I refused to engage with her insults, Serena turned around and dramatically waved her hand toward her husband. "Brad, honey," she called out. "Come look at this. I think she is actually about to cry." Brad paused his conversation with his lead attorney and turned toward us. He smirked, adjusted his heavy gold watch, and walked slowly over to the bench. His 3 lawyers followed closely behind him, standing in a semicircle around me, crossing their arms and looking down at me with identical expressions of bored amusement. They were trying to physically intimidate me, using their height and their numbers to make me feel small and trapped against the wall. Brad stopped right beside his wife. He looked down at me, and I could practically smell the overwhelming wave of his expensive cologne mixed with the scent of his blinding arrogance. He was practically vibrating with excitement. He had spent his entire marriage feeling threatened by my independence, and now he thought he finally had his boot planted firmly on my neck. "Chloe, Chloe, Chloe," Brad said, shaking his head with a condescending sigh. "We tried to do this the easy way. I offered you a very generous $50,000 check at Thanksgiving. I offered you a clean break. But you had to be stubborn. You had to make a massive scene and disrespect my wife in front of our family. So now you get absolutely nothing. You are going to walk out of this building today with no house, no money, and a massive legal bill you will never be able to afford." I swallowed hard, intentionally making my throat click audibly, and finally looked up at him with wide, carefully widened eyes. "But the house," I whispered, keeping my voice incredibly small and slightly shaky. "You cannot just take it. I can, and I absolutely will." Brad shot back instantly, his smile widening into a terrifying grin. "That is how the real world works. The smartest guy in the room takes the prize, and you were completely out of your depth the second you decided to challenge me. You should have taken the money when you had the chance." He leaned in closer to me, completely invading my personal space. He reached out and patronizingly patted me twice on the shoulder. It took every single ounce of self-control I possessed not to grab his wrist and snap it in half right there in the hallway. "But do not worry too much, little sister," Brad mocked, his voice dripping with unbearable sarcasm. "We are not total monsters. When the sheriff's department throws your belongings out onto the street tomorrow morning, we will start a GoFundMe campaign to buy you a nice, waterproof tent. I hear living under the downtown bridge builds great character." Serena let out a loud, shrill cackle of laughter. Brad's lawyers chuckled politely, shaking their heads as they turned back to their briefcases to review their final talking points. They were entirely convinced the battle was already over before they had even stepped foot inside the arena. They had completely written me off as collateral damage in their pursuit of wealth. Suddenly, the heavy wooden double doors of courtroom 4B creaked loudly as they were pushed open from the inside. A stern-looking bailiff stepped out into the hallway, holding a clipboard. "All parties for the Jenkins estate dispute," the bailiff announced, his voice carrying clearly over the hallway chatter. "The Honorable Judge Harrison is ready for you now. Please step inside and take your seats." Brad clapped his hands together eagerly. "Showtime," he announced to his legal team. "Let us go get my house." He offered his arm to Serena, and the two of them walked through the heavy wooden doors with their heads held high, followed closely by their parade of expensive lawyers. They did not even look back at me. I sat on the wooden bench for exactly 3 more seconds. Then, the terrified, shaky victim persona completely evaporated from my body. I let out a long, slow breath, stood up to my full height, and smoothly brushed an imaginary piece of lint off the shoulder of my charcoal suit where Brad had touched me. My posture was perfectly straight. My face was a mask of cold, calculated precision. I heard the distinct sound of heavy rubber wheels rolling rapidly across the marble floor, approaching from down the hallway. I turned my head and saw Maya. My assistant was speed-walking toward me, completely ignoring the security guards and the crowds. She was dressed in a sharp black blazer, her eyes locked entirely on me, and trailing right behind her, gripped firmly in her right hand, was a massive, reinforced black rolling suitcase. It was stuffed to the absolute brim with the notarized bill of sale, 3 years of paid medical receipts, the offshore trust documentation, and the final legally binding foreclosure papers for Bradford Sterling's entire life. Maya stopped right beside me, completely out of breath but smiling fiercely. "The armory is here, boss," she said quietly, releasing the handle of the heavy suitcase. I reached out and grabbed the handle, feeling the incredible weight of the absolute truth in my hand. "Perfect," I replied, my voice completely steady. "Let us go burn their world down." I turned and walked through the courtroom doors, dragging the heavy suitcase right behind me. The heavy wooden doors of courtroom 4B closed behind me with a solid, echoing thud. I walked down the center aisle, the wheels of the heavy black suitcase rolling smoothly across the carpeted floor. Brad and Serena were already seated at the plaintiff's table. Serena was adjusting her dress, trying to look like a grieving, concerned daughter, while Brad leaned back in his chair, whispering something to his lead attorney and grinning. When they saw me approach the defendant's table, Serena leaned over to her husband and whispered loudly enough for me to hear, "Best day ever." She genuinely thought she was about to watch me lose everything. My attorney, a sharp, incredibly composed woman named Eleanor, gave me a subtle nod as I took my seat beside her. Maya sat directly behind me in the gallery, keeping her hand resting protectively on the black suitcase. We did not have to wait long. The bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Harrison took his seat at the high wooden bench. He was an older, stern-looking man who had absolutely no patience for courtroom theatrics. Brad's lead attorney stood up immediately. He began to paint a masterful, completely fictional picture of my family dynamic. He described Serena as the devoted eldest daughter who was simply trying to execute her late father's final wishes. He presented the updated will they had found, claiming it gave them full legal authority to evict me and manage the Victorian estate. To add a layer of emotional manipulation, Serena even took out a lace handkerchief and dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes. "It is just so painful, Your Honor," Serena sniffled, playing her role to absolute perfection. "My sister has been hoarding our father's house, refusing to let the family heal or move forward. We just want what is fair. We just want what our father intended for us." Brad patted her shoulder sympathetically, looking up at the judge with a fake expression of deep, masculine concern. They thought they had the judge completely fooled. They thought their expensive lawyers and their rehearsed tears were a guaranteed victory. But halfway through Serena's tearful performance, right as she was ramping up her fake crying, Judge Harrison suddenly raised his hand. The sharp gesture instantly silenced the courtroom. "Before we continue with this highly emotional testimony," the judge said calmly, his deep voice cutting through the thick tension in the room, "there is something this court needs to address immediately." He reached to the side of his desk and opened a thick, bright red file. It was the exact same file my lawyer had quietly handed to the bailiff right before the proceedings began, containing the documents Maya had brought in the suitcase. Serena's fake smile completely vanished. She slowly lowered her handkerchief, looking confused. Brad's smug posture crumbled in an instant. He sat up straight, his eyes darting between his lead attorney and the judge. The room went dead silent. We had officially caught up to the exact moment their entire world started to burn. Mr. Sterling, the judge continued, looking directly at Brad over the rim of his reading glasses. You are asking this court to validate this updated will and grant you the authority to evict Miss Jenkins from the Victorian property. You are claiming this property is the primary asset of the deceased's estate. That is correct, Your Honor, Brad's lawyer answered smoothly, standing up to defend his client. The property is the crown jewel of the Jenkins family inheritance, and my clients are the rightful executors. Judge Harrison let out a heavy, tired sigh. He closed the red folder and leaned forward. Then I suggest you fire your investigative team, counselor, because the document you just submitted to this court is entirely worthless. The courtroom erupted into a flurry of panicked whispers. Brad's lawyers immediately started aggressively shuffling through their briefcases, frantically checking their paperwork. Brad turned a deep, sickly shade of pale. Serena gasped loudly, gripping the edge of the heavy wooden table. Worthless, Brad's lead attorney stammered, completely losing his slick, composed demeanor. Your Honor, I assure you that will was signed by the deceased. We have witnesses who can verify his handwriting. I do not care if the President of the United States verified his handwriting, the judge fired back, his voice rising in irritation. The will is legally irrelevant because the property in question is not part of this estate. In fact, it has not been part of this estate for a very long time. Brad stood up, completely forgetting courtroom decorum. What do you mean it is not part of the estate? He demanded, his voice cracking with sudden, overwhelming panic. He lived in that house until the day he died. It belongs to the family. Judge Harrison slammed his gavel down once, a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. You will speak when spoken to, Mr. Sterling, or I will have you removed from my courtroom. Now sit down. Brad practically fell back into his chair, breathing heavily. Serena was staring at the judge in absolute shock, her mouth hanging slightly open. She looked over at me, but I just sat there, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely blank. I was letting them drown in their own confusion. According to the authenticated property records, the notarized bill of sale, and the corresponding financial bank transfers I have right here in this folder, the judge explained, reading directly from the documents Maya had provided. Your father voluntarily sold the entire Victorian estate 3 years ago. It was a completely legal, airtight cash transaction. He sold the property for $3 million, and we have the authenticated medical receipts proving he used those exact funds to pay for his extensive private cancer treatments. He did not own that house when he died. He was merely a tenant. Therefore, you cannot inherit it, and you certainly cannot evict anyone from it. The absolute silence that followed was deafening. The wealthy, arrogant facade that Brad and Serena had worn for years was instantly shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The realization hit them like a freight train. The house, the massive $4 million asset they had been planning to sell to a commercial developer, the property they had used to secure their own twisted sense of superiority, was entirely gone. It had never been theirs to claim. Brad's face turned completely red. He grabbed his lawyer's arm, shaking it violently. Do something, he hissed loudly. They are lying. He would never sell the family home without telling us. Check the records. Who bought it? Who the hell bought the house? His lawyer scrambled, pulling out a tablet to desperately search the county property database. The judge saved him the trouble. The property was purchased by a private equity firm, Judge Harrison stated clearly, looking down at the legal transfer of title. The sole owner and legal landlord of the Victorian estate is a corporate entity registered as C.J. Holdings. They have held the absolute, undisputed deed for the last 36 months. Serena shot up from her chair. She was trembling violently, her face contorted with a mixture of blinding rage and sheer terror. The carefully crafted image of the poised, wealthy socialite was completely gone. She looked like a madwoman, What the hell is CJ Holdings? Serena screamed, completely ignoring the judge's earlier warning. Her voice echoed shrilly off the high courtroom ceiling. This is a scam. My father was old and sick. Somebody took advantage of him. Somebody tricked him into signing his house away to some faceless, shady corporation. I demand an investigation. We are going to sue them for every single penny they have. She stood there, chest heaving, pointing an accusing finger at the judge, completely unaware of the massive trap that had just snapped shut around her ankles. Brad's lawyers were burying their faces in their hands, knowing their client had just sealed her own fate in front of a furious judge. I decided it was finally time to end the suspense. I slowly pushed my chair back from the defendant's table. The sound of the wooden legs scraping against the floor drew every single eye in the courtroom directly to me. I stood up to my full height. I reached up and carefully took off my glasses, folding them neatly and placing them on the table. I looked directly into my sister's manic, terrified eyes. I did not yell. I did not have to. My voice was calm, steady, and carrying the absolute weight of a nuclear bomb. It is my company. The silence in the courtroom was so profound you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. For a long, agonizing moment, absolutely nobody moved. Serena stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, her brain entirely failing to process the reality standing right in front of her. Then, the absolute weight of my words finally crashed into them. Brad shot up from his chair so fast it tipped backward and slammed loudly against the wooden railing behind him. The arrogant, composed financial broker was completely gone. His face was entirely drained of color, leaving his skin looking like a sheet of wet paper. "That is impossible," Brad stuttered, his voice cracking violently as he pointed a shaking finger at me. "Your Honor, this is an absolute lie. I know her. She is just a low-level desk worker. She is a single woman living alone. There is absolutely no way she has $3 million in liquid cash to buy a massive estate." He was so incredibly desperate, so entirely consumed by his own sinking ship, that his deep-seated prejudices began spilling out right in front of the judge. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the plaintiff table, his voice dripping with subtle racial microaggressions. "Look at her, Your Honor," Brad pleaded, his tone laced with unbearable condescension. "People like her do not just have that kind of capital sitting around. She does not come from real money. She does not have the connections or the intelligence to run a multi-million-dollar private equity firm. If her name is on that deed, she has to be committing some kind of massive corporate fraud. She probably stole the identity of a real investor. I demand a full federal investigation into her finances immediately." A low murmur of absolute disgust rippled through the courtroom gallery. Even Brad's own highly paid legal team looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and refusing to make eye contact with their client. They knew a sinking ship when they saw one, and Brad was actively drilling holes in the bottom of the boat. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger at his pathetic insults. I simply looked at my lead attorney, Eleanor, and gave her a slight nod. Eleanor stood up gracefully, smoothing her blazer, completely unbothered by Brad's hysterical outburst. "Your Honor," Eleanor said, her clear, authoritative voice projecting effortlessly across the room, "we have provided the court with the full corporate registration documents for CJ Holdings, the verified and audited bank transfers, and the authenticated federal tax returns proving my client is the sole owner, founder, and chief executive officer of the firm. Furthermore, all funds used to purchase the Victorian property were thoroughly vetted and cleared by federal banking regulators 3 years ago. There is absolutely no fraud, only my client's hard-earned legitimate success." Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses and spent a long, agonizing minute flipping through the thick stack of financial records. Every single page was an ironclad testament to the empire I had built, while my family was busy treating me like an outcast. The judge looked up from the folder, his expression hardening as he glared directly at Brad. "The financial records are completely transparent and legally flawless, Mr. Sterling," the judge stated coldly. "I highly suggest you watch your tone and your accusations in my courtroom. Miss Jenkins is the legal, undisputed owner of the property. The sale was executed legally, and the funds were transferred directly from her corporate accounts." Serena finally found her voice. She grabbed the edge of the table, her knuckles turning completely white. "But why?" she demanded, her voice shrill and trembling with desperate confusion. Why would Dad sell the family legacy to her in secret? What did he even do with $3 million in cash? He had basic health insurance. He did not need that kind of money. I stepped out from behind the defendant's table. I wanted her to look me directly in the eyes when I shattered the very last illusion she had about her perfect life. "Basic health insurance does not cover stage 4 aggressive oncology treatments, Serena," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet courtroom like a sharpened blade. "It does not cover the specialized experimental radiation therapies, the 24-hour private nursing staff, or the imported pain management medications he desperately needed to survive his final years." Serena stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently. "He sold the house to me because he knew exactly who you and Mom really were," I continued, refusing to look away from her terrified face. "He knew that if he asked either of you to sell the estate to pay for his cancer treatments, you would have completely refused. You would have locked him away in a cheap, underfunded state facility just to preserve your precious inheritance and your high society image." "That is a lie," Serena gasped, tears of genuine panic finally spilling over her eyelashes. "We loved him. We would have done anything for him. You abandoned him," I fired back, my voice echoing with years of suppressed grief and righteous anger. "You and Mom spent his final months drinking expensive vintage champagne in Italy and shopping for designer handbags in Paris, while I liquidated my own personal stock portfolio to keep him breathing. The $3 million I paid for that house went directly into a hidden offshore medical trust. Every single penny of my money was spent keeping our father comfortable, while you completely ignored his phone calls because his suffering was too depressing for you to deal with." The entire courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath. The heavy, ugly truth hung in the air, completely suffocating Serena. She collapsed back into her chair, covering her face with her hands and sobbing violently. It was not a fake, rehearsed cry for the judge. It was the devastating, ugly cry of a woman whose absolute worst sins had just been broadcast to the entire world. She was publicly exposed as a greedy, negligent daughter who had abandoned her dying father for a luxury vacation. Brad stood there frozen, completely out of ammunition. His expensive lawyers had already packed their Italian leather briefcases and were quietly preparing to distance themselves from him the absolute second the hearing was adjourned. Brad realized he had completely lost the house. He had lost his massive payday. He had lost his leverage over me, and he had permanently lost his unearned superiority. He slowly sank back into his chair, staring blankly at the wooden table. He tried to swallow, but his throat was visibly dry. "Well," he muttered weakly, his voice barely a whisper, "the eviction is void. We withdraw the claim for the property." He thought the brutal execution was finally over. He genuinely believed that since he had surrendered his claim to my house, the judge would simply dismiss the case and let him walk out the double doors to lick his wounds in peace. He thought the absolute worst thing that could happen to him today was leaving empty-handed. But I did not bring a massive black suitcase full of financial documents to court just to play defense. I came to completely level his entire existence. I turned away from my sobbing sister and my broken brother-in-law. I faced the high wooden bench, keeping my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely calm and devoid of any mercy. "Your Honor," I said clearly, my voice ringing out and demanding the court's full attention once again. I would like to submit another file regarding the $300,000 compensation my brother-in-law just demanded. Judge Harrison looked down at me from the bench, his thick gray eyebrows raising in surprise. He gestured for the bailiff to approach my table. My attorney handed over the thick red file that Maya had brought in the black suitcase. It was the exact same red folder that my sister had carelessly kicked across the lobby floor of my office building just a few days ago. The judge opened the file, his eyes scanning the first page. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the rustle of the heavy paper echoing off the wood-paneled walls. I turned my body completely away from the judge and faced Brad. He was slumped in his chair, looking like a man who had just been hit by a massive truck, but he still had absolutely no idea that the real impact was just about to hit him. My brother-in-law came into this courtroom today demanding a judgment of $300,000, I began, pacing slowly in front of the defendant's table. He claimed it was for unpaid rent and property damages. But I found that specific number to be incredibly fascinating. $300,000 is a very precise amount of money. It is not a random number pulled out of thin air. Brad's eyes suddenly darted up to meet mine, the absolute terror returning to his pale face. He swallowed hard, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He knew exactly where I was going, and he was entirely powerless to stop me. You see, Brad has spent the last 5 years walking around Atlanta telling everyone who would listen that he is a financial genius, I continued, my voice steady and commanding. He told our family that his brokerage firm was expanding rapidly. He used that fake success to justify looking down on me, to control my sister, and to act like the wealthy savior of the Jenkins family. But the truth is entirely different. I stopped pacing and looked directly at Serena. She was still wiping her tear-stained face, looking up at me with red, swollen eyes. Brad's brokerage firm actually filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Exactly 2 years ago, I stated clearly, letting the words echo in the silent room. Serena froze. She slowly turned her head to look at her husband. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Brad could not even look at her. He just stared straight ahead, his chest heaving as he tried to take shallow, panicked breaths. "That is right, Serena," I said, refusing to let her look away from the reality she had married. "Your husband is not a successful broker. He has not closed a single legitimate corporate deal in 24 months. His firm went completely under." But Brad could not bear the thought of losing his wealthy image. He could not stand the thought of you finding out that he was a massive failure. So, to keep up the expensive illusion of his success, to keep paying for your luxury cars and your designer clothes, he took a massive, desperate gamble behind your back. I took a few steps closer to the plaintiff's table, closing the distance between us. Brad's lawyers had actually physically scooted their chairs slightly away from him, completely abandoning their client to the slaughter. Without telling you, Brad cross-collateralized your beautiful, sprawling mansion in Buckhead, I explained, making sure every single person in the courtroom understood the absolute gravity of his crime. He took the deed to the home you share, the home your children sleep in, and he used it as collateral to take out a massive $1.2 million high-interest loan. Serena let out a sharp, horrifying gasp. She grabbed Brad's arm, digging her manicured nails into his expensive suit jacket. "Tell me she is lying," Serena hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of absolute rage and blinding panic. "Brad, tell me right now that she is making this up. We own that house. We paid it off." Brad did not say a word. He just closed his eyes, a single drop of sweat rolling down the side of his pale face. His silence was the loudest, most damning confession he could ever make. "He went to an anonymous private equity fund to get the money," I continued, my voice rising slightly to dominate the room. Because no legitimate, federally regulated bank would ever lend $1 million to a bankrupt broker with absolutely no steady income. He signed the paperwork in secret. He took the cash, and he used it to pretend he was still rich. But high-interest loans from private equity funds require massive monthly payments, and Brad ran completely out of money to make those payments exactly 8 months ago. The gallery erupted into shocked whispers. The people sitting in the back rows of the courtroom were leaning forward, completely captivated by the brutal, systematic destruction of a man who had walked in, acting like a king. Judge Harrison banged his gavel twice to restore order, but he did not interrupt me. He was staring at the financial documents in the red folder, clearly verifying every single word I was saying. "He is in total default," I said, pointing directly at Brad. "His grace period expired weeks ago, and the penalty for defaulting on that specific loan is the immediate, non-negotiable forfeiture of the collateral. The Buckhead Mansion. That is why he was so incredibly desperate to steal our father's estate today. He needed a place for you to live, Serena, because he knew your house was about to be taken away. And that $300,000 he sued me for today. That is the exact amount he currently owes in late fees and penalties just to temporarily stop the foreclosure process." Serena let go of Brad's arm like he was suddenly on fire. She covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a muffled, agonizing sob as her entire wealthy, perfect life completely disintegrated right in front of her eyes. She had treated me like garbage for years because she felt superior, because she thought her husband was a brilliant provider and a success. Now she was staring at the horrifying reality that she was married to a broke, deceitful fraud who had literally gambled her home away to save his own fragile ego. I walked right up to the heavy wooden table where Brad was sitting. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely no pity, no mercy, and no regret. This was the man who had cornered me in the freezing rain at my father's funeral. This was the man who had mocked me, threatened me, and tried to leave me homeless on the streets. I reached over and picked up the duplicate copy of the red file that my lawyer had placed on their table. I held it up so Brad could clearly see the bold black text printed across the front. Bradford's sterling notice of default and foreclosure. Brad finally looked up at me. His arrogant blue eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with tears of pure terror. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had finally snapped shut. "He took the loan from a highly exclusive, completely anonymous private equity fund," I whispered, my voice dripping with dark, poetic justice. "A fund that specializes in acquiring high-risk, distressed debt from desperate people." I paused, letting the silence stretch for one agonizing second. "And guess who owns that private equity fund, Brad?" I threw the heavy red file directly onto the table right in front of him. It landed with a loud, sharp smack that made him physically jump in his chair. The file slid across the polished wood and stopped perfectly in front of his shaking hands. The courtroom completely exploded. The gallery erupted into loud gasps and murmurs. People were literally covering their mouths in shock. Even the bailiff standing by the heavy wooden doors let out a low whistle of absolute disbelief. The sheer magnitude of the twist was undeniable. I was not just the woman who owned the family estate. I was the silent, anonymous creditor who literally owned his entire life. I had been holding the strings this entire time, letting him dance around and make a fool of himself before finally deciding to cut him loose. Brad stared down at the file, his breathing fast and shallow. He was hyperventilating. He looked at the corporate logo printed on the foreclosure document, and then looked back up at me. The realization that he had spent the last 2 years actively trying to destroy the only person who held the power to save him was entirely too much for his brain to process. He had literally sued his own landlord, his own bank, and his own executioner all at the exact same time. "You see, Brad," I said, leaning in close so he could hear every single syllable over the noise of the shocked courtroom. "You walked in here today thinking you could intimidate me. You thought you could use the legal system to bully a black woman out of her home just because you felt entitled to it. You thought you were the smartest guy in the room. I stood back up to my full height, smoothing out my custom-tailored charcoal suit. I looked at the pathetic, ruined man sitting at the table, and then I delivered the final, fatal blow to his massive ego. I do not owe you $300,000, Brad. I smirked, letting a cold, ruthless smile finally touch my face. You owe me the house you are living in. Judge Harrison did not hesitate for a single second. He looked down at the heavily documented file of defaults and missed payments, picked up his heavy wooden gavel, and brought it down with a resounding crack that sealed Bradford Sterling's absolute ruin. The notice of foreclosure is officially recognized and approved by this court, Judge Harrison declared, his voice cutting through the stunned whispers of the gallery. This hearing is adjourned. The words hit Brad like a physical blow to the stomach. His knees instantly buckled beneath him. He grabbed the edge of the heavy oak table, but his arms were shaking too violently to support his own weight. He completely collapsed into his chair, his head dropping into his hands. The flawless, expensive facade of the brilliant financial savior was entirely stripped away, leaving nothing behind but a pathetic, terrified man drowning in his own catastrophic lies. Beside him, Serena was completely frozen. She looked at the judge, then down at the foreclosure documents, and finally at her trembling husband. The realization of what this truly meant washed over her in a violent wave. She was not just losing the Victorian estate. She was losing her massive mansion in Buckhead. She was losing her imported luxury cars, her exclusive country club memberships, her designer wardrobe, and every single ounce of the high society dignity she had spent her entire life stepping on others to maintain. She was going to be completely destitute. Something inside Serena violently snapped. She let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream that echoed off the high courtroom ceilings and lunged directly at Brad. She completely bypassed any remaining sense of decorum and went absolutely feral. She grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive custom suit, pulling him half out of his chair, and began slapping him repeatedly across the face. "You lied to me!" Serena shrieked, her voice tearing with raw, unhinged fury as her hands connected with his cheeks. "You ruined my life. You promised me wealth, you pathetic fraud. You lost my house. You lost everything." Brad tried to raise his arms to shield his face, cowering away from her vicious attack. But Serena was fueled by pure, blinding adrenaline. She scratched at his face, tearing his silk tie, sending his legal paperwork flying across the floor like confetti. The courtroom immediately descended into absolute chaos. The gallery erupted into shouts. Brad's highly paid lawyers practically sprinted away from the table to avoid the crossfire, refusing to intervene as their former client was publicly beaten by his own wife. "Bailiffs!" Judge Harrison yelled over the screaming, banging his gavel repeatedly to try and regain order in his courtroom. "Restrain her immediately." 3 heavily armed police officers and 2 court bailiffs rushed down the center aisle. They had to physically pry Serena's fingers off Brad's torn suit jacket, dragging her kicking and screaming away from him. She thrashed wildly against the officers, her designer dress twisting, her perfect hair completely ruined, looking absolutely nothing like the arrogant golden child who had walked into the building just an hour earlier. She was entirely unrecognizable, stripped of her pride, and forced to face the bitter consequences of her own blinding greed. As the officers restrained my sister and Brad sat weeping at the plaintiff's table, my eyes drifted up to the gallery. Sitting in the second row, completely paralyzed by the horrifying spectacle, was my mother. Vivian was clutching her chest with both hands, her face entirely drained of color, gasping for air as if she were having a heart attack. She was sobbing hysterically, tears streaming down her carefully powdered cheeks, unable to look away from the violent collapse of her perfect family. In that exact moment, the devastating truth finally pierced through her decades of delusion. She realized that the brilliant, wealthy white son-in-law she had practically worshipped and chosen over her own flesh and blood, was actually nothing but a broke, gold-digging fraud who had just dragged her favorite daughter straight to the bottom of the ocean. I pushed open the heavy double doors and walked out of courtroom 4B, leaving the screaming and the chaos entirely behind me. The cool air of the marble hallway felt incredibly refreshing against my skin. I took a deep breath, adjusting my leather clutch, and started walking toward the elevators. I was finally done. The decades of emotional abuse, the constant belittling, the endless comparisons to my perfect sister. It was all officially over. But I had only made it about 20 feet down the corridor when I heard the frantic, echoing sound of footsteps running up behind me. "Chloe, wait!" a ragged voice cried out. "Chloe, please stop!" I paused, turning around slowly. It was my mother. Vivian looked absolutely destroyed. Her flawless makeup was completely ruined by her tears, running in dark streaks down her face. She was trembling uncontrollably, her chest heaving as she closed the distance between us. She reached out and grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into the sleeve of my suit with a desperate, panicked grip. "Chloe, you cannot do this!" Vivian sobbed, her voice cracking as she looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "You cannot take their house away. Where will your sister go? Where will my grandchildren sleep? Please, I am begging you. You have to cancel the foreclosure. You have the power to stop this right now. We are family. You cannot just destroy your own flesh and blood like this." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. For my entire life, I had craved her affection. I had worked myself to the bone trying to earn just a fraction of the love and approval she so easily handed to Serena. I used to think I would do absolutely anything to hear her say she was proud of me. But standing there in the cold courthouse hallway, looking at the pathetic, desperate woman begging me to save the exact people who had just tried to leave me homeless, I felt absolutely nothing. The camera would push in right here, a slow, tight dolly shot closing in on my face as my expression turned to pure ice. I reached over and firmly grabbed her wrist. I pulled her hand off my arm, deliberately dropping it back to her side. "You once told me that living alone in that big estate was entirely too selfish," I said, my voice dangerously quiet and perfectly steady. "You stood in the cemetery at Dad's funeral and told me I was a spoiled brat for wanting to keep my own home. You slapped me across the face at Thanksgiving and demanded I sacrifice my peace for her comfort. So, since you care so much about your grandchildren, and now that Serena is about to be completely homeless, you should be the one to step up and take her in." Vivian sniffled, trying to catch her breath, nodding her head rapidly. "I will," she choked out. "Of course I will. They can come live with me. We will figure it out together. Just please, Chloe, forgive us." I tilted my head slightly, watching her cling to her very last shred of hope. I almost felt sorry for her, but I knew she had brought every single ounce of this misery upon herself. "That is a really beautiful sentiment, Mom," I whispered, delivering the final, crushing blow. "But it is going to be incredibly difficult for you to host her, because it is too bad your house was secretly put up as collateral by Brad, too." Vivian froze. The desperate nodding stopped instantly. Her eyes widened to an unnatural size as the words slowly registered in her brain. "When Brad realized he was defaulting on the mansion," I explained, maintaining direct, unwavering eye contact, "he panicked. He forged your signature on a secondary guarantor agreement 3 months ago to buy himself a little more time. Since you trusted him blindly and gave him total access to your financial records, it was incredibly easy for him to do. He attached the deed of your home to his toxic debt. When the bank comes to seize his assets this week, they are coming for yours too. You are going to lose absolutely everything." Vivian's mouth fell open in a silent scream. Her legs completely gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the hard marble floor of the courthouse hallway, clutching her chest and wailing in pure, unadulterated agony. She was completely broken, shattered by the realization that her golden child and her perfect son-in-law had literally cost her her entire livelihood. I did not reach down to help her up. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply turned on my heel, walked toward the elevator, and pressed the button to go down. The heavy silver doors slid open. I stepped inside and I rode down to the lobby without looking back at her a single time. The heavy silver doors slid shut, sealing away the past, and my private elevator brought me right back to the present. I stand here now in the quiet luxury of my downtown Atlanta penthouse. Outside my floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline sparkles like scattered diamonds against the deep night sky. I raise my crystal glass and take the final sip of my aged bourbon, feeling the smooth warmth settle in my chest. It has been nearly a year since that explosive morning in courtroom 4B, and the dust has finally settled. The collapse of Bradford Sterling was absolute and spectacular. My firm executed the foreclosure without a single ounce of mercy. We took the Buckhead mansion, the luxury vehicles, and every single liquidated asset we could legally seize. But the financial ruin was only the beginning. Once the legitimate banks realized Brad had forged my mother's signature to cross-collateralize her property, the federal authorities immediately got involved. Brad is currently under active federal investigation for multiple counts of felony wire fraud and identity theft. He is looking at a very long, very bleak prison sentence. Serena was violently thrown from her high society pedestal. Stripped of her designer clothes, her exclusive country club memberships, and her wealthy friends, she was forced to move into a cramped, run-down apartment complex on the far outskirts of the city. She works a grueling retail job now, ringing up the exact same people she used to look down on. And just as I predicted, my mother had to move right into that tiny apartment with her after the bank officially seized her home. From what I hear through the grapevine, they spend their days trapped in that small space, bitterly screaming at each other and blaming one another for everything they lost. As for the rest of my extended family, the aunts and uncles who sat at that Thanksgiving table and demanded I surrender my worth, they are completely silent. Nobody ever dares to mention my name. I am the absolute taboo, the ghost they are all entirely too terrified to speak of. They finally learned what happens when you mistake a woman's silence for weakness. But the most satisfying victory of all is what I did with the Victorian estate. I did not sell it to a commercial developer. I poured $2 million of my own capital into completely gutting and renovating the interior. I transformed my father's massive, historic home into a state-of-the-art startup incubator designed exclusively to fund and support minority women launching their own businesses. I named it the Theodore Jenkins Innovation Center. Dad's true legacy is not an empty house for greedy people to fight over. His legacy is actively helping brilliant, independent women build their own empires so they never have to rely on anyone else. I walk slowly over to my mahogany desk and set my empty crystal glass down on the polished wood surface. I turn to face the camera directly, standing tall, completely at peace with the life I built and the ties I severed to protect it. I let a cold, sharp smile spread across my face as I look dead into the lens. Family is not a free pass for people to walk all over you. Sometimes, the best day ever is the day you personally burn the bridge to toxic people. The screen fades to absolute black as a heavy, powerful rhythm and blues track begins to play.